Good afternoon from the Fair Job Podcast. I'm Richard Palmer.
And I'm Steve Chilcott.
So today we are going to be looking at the employment policies of the Lib Dem Party and the Tory Party, the Conservative Party. And I'm not sure about you, Steve, but after our 1 hour marathon into Labour's yesterday, I'm sort of slightly getting near towards the end of the will to live.
Already, and we've only done one.
And we've only done the one. So I hope you've got some interesting and some good news in the pipeline for me today.
So today, as opposed to yesterday, today we're actually going to be basing our discussion on the actual reality of both the Lib Dems and the Conservative Party's positions, because both have now released their manifestos. So the Lib Dems released their manifesto yesterday, and then the Conservative Party released their manifesto at lunchtime today. So I've had a chance to go through both. Because obviously yesterday, the Labour Party still haven't released theirs. I believe it's due to be released on Thursday, if I'm correct on that. So we're just going on what they published to date on their website, which is a lot of information, but obviously we don't know whether it's going to be the information that falls through into the manifesto. So let's start with the Lib Dems. And I guess people might be thinking, why are we bothering? But of course... The Lib Dems, it is not beyond the realms of possibility that the Lib Dems could end up in a coalition. Probably more likely to be with the Labour Party, I might suggest, than with the Conservative Party. And I'd probably also say, I think possibly the chance of the Labour Party needing the Lib Dems to form a coalition might be at the slimmer end of the probability scale, but nonetheless, we don't know until the fat ladies sing on July the 4th. So anyway, so having a look at the Lib Dem manifesto. Now, I really have to say there are some quite positive words in there, particularly I think around for business and industrial strategy. But again, there are a handful of points that we might not think are quite so positive. So, they certainly start off by saying some things that sound very welcome. So, they want to make Britain one of the most attractive places in the world for businesses to invest. They acknowledge that private enterprise, is the principal engine of growth and prosperity for the country. So, lots of good sounding words. And they go on to say quite a lot about wanting to develop a thorough industrial strategy. To give businesses certainty and incentivize investment, particularly around new technologies, for example. And they also talk a lot about investing in education and training. And as we discussed yesterday with the Labour Party, they're very much talking about broadening apprenticeships beyond just apprenticeships, so into other areas of training and increasing the availability for young people. So I think that's all good stuff. And one specific thing, and I mean, some of what we're talking about here is more about just sort of business principles rather than necessarily specifically sort of employment matters. But they are looking at abolishing business rates and replacing them with a commercial landowner levy for the high streets. Not quite sure what the detail of that, but it seems that they're doing it from a business focused area. Now, the first note of concern is that, and this is quite a generic statement, so I don't know what it would look like in reality, but they want to introduce a general duty of care for the environment and human rights in business operations and in supply chains. Now, again, that sounds like they're going more formally down the ESG road. So
bloody hell. Okay.
Quite. So moving on from that low point, again, as with Labour, they're talking about revising the apprenticeship levy to
Yeah.
making it broader and more flexible, how that can be
And actually,
utilised by employers.
we sort of accepted that as a fairly positive policy from Labour yesterday, didn't we?
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, the apprenticeship levy was brought in a few years ago, and it's the fund is now very large, isn't it, Steve? And no one's spending it, no one's accessing it.
No, quite, yes.
So, I actually saw Sunak was in the paper yesterday talking about there's been a number of business funds that businesses have been entitled to that have been very badly publicised. And he's trying to urge people, businesses to get out there and apply for another one. I can't even remember what it was. It's been so badly publicised. But it is. I think this is welcome because it shows that they are at least thinking about they're thinking about how to solve problems. And a huge problem we've got at the moment is training and development.
Yeah, absolutely. And now one thing that they're suggesting, which is good for apprentices themselves, but will cost businesses something. But frankly, I think it's quite a reasonable thing to do. So with the national minimum wage, currently there is a specific apprenticeship national minimum wage, which I forget what it is, but it's significantly lower than the normal national minimum wage. So Lib Dems are talking about getting rid of that and putting apprentices on the normal rate of national living wage.
Yeah,
which it will be an additional cost to some organisations, but frankly, to me, I think it's quite reasonable.
So some businesses I know, including I think my last employer, when we were taking on apprentices, I think for the first 2 or 3 months we had them on the apprentice wage, and then after that we actually had them on a wage that was considerably higher than the minimum wage. We actually put them on a salary, on a trainee salary, and that's mostly because it's a significant investment in your apprenticeship. Apprentices, and particularly then because we were taking on apprentice nurses, and you're putting a lot of money into them. You want to make sure you're getting some return on your investment, and so you've got to make it attractive for them, and you've also got to make it. So the other thing that's quite short-sighted about paying them poorly is, first of all, creates this idea that apprentices are sort of what they used to be in the old days. 14-year-olds going off to do their apprenticeship, and therefore they're living at home so they can be paid as 14-year-olds. The reality of the situation is that's not the case anymore. People have got same sort of expenses. You want to try and encourage people to change career, to retrain. How can they possibly do that if they're going to take a huge financial hit? The other issue that you have from apprenticeship schemes is the number of dropouts that you get. And this is a real issue. Some of the bigger companies I've worked with, you're looking at dropout rates of 80% on apprenticeship schemes. Now, one of the ways you can get around that is by incentivizing the apprentices with decent salaries and with the opportunity to earn more as they progress through their apprenticeship. So my advice would be to look at this as a long-term investment for workers, and I think this is a really good idea by the Lib Dems. I hope that it is adopted by whoever wins the election, because it certainly sounds like the right way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a few more things in the sort of area of learning. They're proposing to create a new lifelong skills grants for adults to spend on education and training throughout their careers. They look at developing national colleges as national centres of expertise in key sectors. And delivering high-level vocational skills that businesses need, identifying, seeking to solve skills gaps, such as advanced technicians, expanding higher vocational training with foundation degrees, higher national diplomas, higher national certificates, and higher apprenticeships as well. So again, I think the more focus we can do as a country on the more vocational end of training and development, I think more the better. I think I think we did touch on yesterday. Too much time in terms of higher education has been focused on the university sector and degrees.
Those of us who were kicking around in the 1990s can remember the huge push to put everybody through university education, and at the time, I remember there's been quite a movement saying this is a very foolish idea. Dismantling the polytechnics is not a sensible idea, and in fact, that has been well and truly demonstrated. And if you compare our situation to that of the Germans, where vocational skills are highly valued in their society, are highly rated as being valid career paths, and not seen as some sort of second best. And I do think that this situation of universities was a sort of reaction to the class system that we still have in the UK. This hang up about class, this idea that because somebody works with their hands or is in an industry like manufacturing or something, they're somehow less refined than somebody who sits in their bum and works behind a desk. We've got to, as a society, we need to shake off some of this stuff.
Yeah. So another point, I think very similar to the Labour Party, they're talking about establishing one new worker protection enforcement authority, unifying the responsibilities from the three agencies currently. So, one agency that looks at things like enforcing the minimum wage, modern slavery, and protecting agency workers. They do talk about establishing an independent review to recommend a genuine living wage across all sectors, with government departments and other public sector employers taking a leading role in paying it. So that doesn't sound like it's anything, it's going to be a statutory thing enforced across the entire economy. But it might be something that they'd be looking at, certainly enforcing within the public sector, which of course is only going to drive.
Well, a cynic might suggest that this is the bribe for the public sector. As you say, Steve, unless it's a statutory demand, why would any small business or any business do it unless it was absolutely essential? There are companies out there who pay national living wage, but as a taxpayer, I myself am concerned about the bloat in the public sector, and very much also concerned about the two-tier of individual we have in this country these days. There's those of us who grind it out in the private sector, particularly in small businesses like ours, and then there are those people who are fortunate enough to be employed as in the public sector with their gilt pensions and their paid holidays, etc. So anyway, I'll stop right there. I'm not going to go down that particular rabbit hole again.
Now, the next one I don't understand or agree with, and it's kind of in consequence to the gig economy. Now, and they're talking about establishing a new sort of legal status of what they call a dependent contractor employment status that is in between employment and self-employment. With some entitlements to basic rights such as minimum earning levels, sick pay, holiday entitlements. Now, I know, as a matter of fact, even in the current situation, there is frequently confusion over those two existing ones. So the concept of introducing yet another one, I'm not sure whether that's certainly not simplification.
Yeah. Well,
May add to the confusion and misunderstanding of businesses of what the person that they have working for them actually constitutes from a status perspective, but also could be pushing the costs up in terms of creating this new status that will have certain rights that maybe individuals that move into that status wouldn't have previously had.
It sounds to me like a bodge. And
yes.
What it's bodging is it's bodging the second half of the IR35 law, which was never implemented. So if you remember back in the 19th century when IR35 was first mooted, seems like that long ago. The IR35 was meant to come in two parts. The first bit is a bit that's been implemented, but there was meant to be a payback for people who were caught in employment scenarios, and that was to extend them a degree of rights, limited rights, in exchange for them having to give up their status as self-employed. Now, yesterday we talked about what Labour was looking at doing in this, and that was extending more rights to people who were found inside IR35 but were still self-employed. So this smacks a little bit of that, and I think that the problem here is to try and address the issues around IR35, because there's massive unfairness here for those who are caught inside IR35, who are expected to meet PAYE obligations, but don't get any of the protections that PAYE gives full-time employees. So you get this sort of two-tier employment world of employment. And what's particularly nefarious about this is the worst offenders of this are in the public sector. There's a massive difference between being a permanent employee in the public sector and having those rights and being a inside IR35 contractor, where you're still getting taxed the same, you're getting paid very similar, but you don't get any of the rights or benefits, etc. So I think that what they're trying to do here is they're trying to address that problem without scrapping IR35, which of course is ultimately, the thing that Liz Truss tried to do. I've got a lot of experience of this area. If anybody does have any queries around IR35, and although most of our small business customers won't, if you're a larger business, then do get in touch, because Steve and I are both quite well versed in that.
Sure. Now, this next one's a bodge as well, I would suggest, and it's around 0 hours contracts.
Oh God, here we go.
Now, they're not banning them. They're not going anywhere near as far as the Labour Party are. However, and you will laugh at this one, they are saying that those on 0 hours contracts must have a higher minimum wage, must have a 20% higher minimum wage than those on normal employment contracts. So it's basically saying you can have a 0 hours contract, but you must pay them a higher hourly rate.
So I think that this is aimed at the NHS.
Yes, and this is the conversation that you and I had yesterday after the recording, wasn't it? Actually, comparing agency workers and
so bank rates. So just those who aren't au fait with what a bank is in employment terms, some large employer organisations create what's called a staff bank, which are members, which are workers, or they sometimes they don't have permanent contracts with that business, but who want to pick up hours at that organisation, and they do so by holding a 0 hours contract with that organisation. So if you are an NHS trust, you'll staff your nursing shifts or your doctor shifts or physio shifts or whatever 3 ways. 4 ways. You'll have your permanent employees, you'll have your overtime, which is used in exceptional circumstances, like, Mrs. Snooks' colostomy bags just burst, can you stay another hour? That type of situation. Then you'll get what's called staff bank, and then you get your agency workers. And if you're running your business properly, if you're running your NHS trust properly, then what you'll do is you'll start off with filling your shifts with permanent employees, then you'll go to staff bank employees, then you'll go into agency employees, and at the very last one, if you can't fill a shift, you see if you put it out for overtime and see if you can get someone to do it. Now, one of the things about staff bank shifts in the NHS is they cost a lot of money. They don't cost as much as agency shifts, but they are expensive. So, for instance, a junior doctor may well see a bank rate in an A&E department of in excess of £120 an hour. We'll see it sometimes specialist nurses will be seeing very, very high rates at 3 or 4 times their normal hourly rate. Now, I think what this is a way to try and get some control over that spend. And I also think that it's a way of also encouraging NHS trusts to use staff banks for non-clinical workers. So if you're able to go, we'll pay you £20 more to stay a couple of hours late or to pick up an extra shift, rather than having to go to a recruitment agency to get a temp in. So I suspect there's a bit of that here. So when people talk about 0 hours contract, by far and away the biggest user of 0 hours contracts is the NHS. And I think there's an element of that here. And I think it's been dressed up as, trying to sort of, incentivize the worker a bit. Certainly, I think it's a better idea than what Labour are coming out with around compensating for shift cancellation, which just shows no understanding of how shift work works.
Yep. And then just one further point that the Lib Dems are saying in regards to 0 hours contracts, they're saying that giving a right to request a fixed hours contract after 12 months on a 0 hours contract. So that's only the right to request. So as with flexible working, people will have the legal right to make a request. It can be declined by the employer, but only if there are reasonable reasons not to. I mean, it doesn't feel wholly inappropriate.
No.
If someone's been working for 12 months, they've been good, they've been available when needed, why not allow them the right to ask for a contract?
What I don't understand about this one is the moment your 0 hours contract starts to form a pattern, a regular pattern, and that pattern starts to become a working pattern over a period of months, then that effectively forms a permanent contract.
Well, quite, and that can be a real risk that, again, I've witnessed where, I agree with you. 0 hours, I think contracts are great. They can be very, very useful for both parties. There are absolutely, which is why the Labour position is so nonsense, because there are many people who really like and want a 0 hours contract, but they're also given amazing flexibility for the employer. But as you say, employers must be very careful that a 0 hours person isn't regularly working set hours, because they will acquire entitlement anyway.
And just on that fact, this is why I don't understand Labour's position here, because employment law, i.e. that principle that if you are using somebody regularly, you have to, and let's say somebody's working every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, and they're doing that on a 0 hours contract, well, you actually have to effectively extend them a part-time contract, a part-time permanent contract. Because that's what they're on. Because if you treat them any other way other than a part-time worker in that circumstance, then you're going to be liable. And so the employment law already protects people against being abused on 0 hours contracts. So,
frankly, it's just ignorance, isn't it, of the policy advisors in political parties.
Well, far be it from a policy advisor in any of these political parties to actually pick up the phone and speak to people who actually know what they're talking about.
Yes, right. So moving on, again, the Lib Dems talk about expanding parental leave and pay and making them day one rights, which, the Conservatives already started moving in that direction. Statutory sick pay. So if you remember, the Labour Party were removing, that again, we're making statutory sick pay a day for the first day of absence, whereas currently you only get it on the fourth day. That Lib Dems are doing the same. However, what's even more significant was that Lib Dems, they're saying raising the rate of statutory sick pay to the national minimum wage. So I calculated that would be £400 plus currently per week statutory sick pay, whereas currently it's 100 and something a week. I forget precisely what it is. So, more than tripling the rate of statutory sick pay is what they're proposing. Although they do say, interestingly, for some of our businesses, supporting small employers with statutory sick pay costs, and consulting with them how to do that. And then going back to IR35, the Lib Dems do say that they would be recommending a review of IR35 to ensure that self-employed people are treated fairly. So, that sounds a reasonable thing to throw. So, and then last few points. This is an interesting one. So, obviously, wouldn't be surprised that the Lib Dems are very in favour of the Equality Act, of which some aspects we would be so. We wouldn't say that the entire thing needs to be thrown out. But what the Lib Dems are proposing is to make caring and care experience a protected characteristic. So if you have care responsibilities, you're a parent, you're caring for a disabled relative or an unwell, or someone with a disability, that would be considered a protected characteristic.
So I mean, this is a really good example of where good practice should reign over statutory requirement.
Quite.
It's good practice to take into consideration people who are parents or who are caring for people and you're employing them. That's good practice. And the vast majority of employers will follow good practice. To make it a statutory requirement and put it into the Equalities Act. Now, look, I've got kids. You know, I'm getting to the age when I'm going to start caring for parents and things. I don't relish any of that. It's been tough, you know, managing the kids over the time when they've been growing up. They're now teenagers, and you know, it's tough balancing these things off. But you know, making this a statutory point of law and then bunging it in on the Equality Act, I think does two things. I think first of all, it's unnecessary. I think this could be managed far better outside the Equality Act. And I think it also, expanding the Equality Act like this for something that's actually an activity as opposed to an immutable characteristic or a belief, blurs what the Equality Act is for.
Yeah, as you say, I think it feels more comfortable if the protected characteristics that get legal protection in the workplace or in service provision or anywhere else are immutable characteristics. But obviously, you know, when religious belief was thrown into the pot, that's not an immutable characteristic, and clearly carer responsibilities are not an immutable characteristic. So, you know, how long does this, you know, how far does this one go? You know, will the next level be pet care?
Well, exactly.
You know, after a pet, and that becomes a protected characteristic.
I mean, we can have a conversation about the Equality Act at some point. I think we probably do need to. But I don't understand this because this strikes me as just lazy policy making. Because frankly, you know, you could build those protections into the Employment Act rather than into the Equality Act, and that would be the route to go. And it would be quite easy to do. You just protect it the same way that, you know, you protect paternity leave or whatever, you know. Paternity leave, you know, parental leave is not part of the Equality Act. So, you know, if you're going to do this, then why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah. So on the remaining on the subject of EDI, they also talk about some things that are, to be honest, either for large employers or for the public sector, but it could have some bearing on some of our viewers. So they're going to require large employers to monitor and publish data on gender, ethnicity, disability, and LGBT plus employment levels, pay gaps, progression, and publish 5-year aspirational diversity targets.
Oh, sorry. I nearly swore there.
You nearly swore
there.
You are live. Please do not swear. And the second one, extend the use of name-blind recruitment processes in the public sector, encouraging their use in the private sector. So by that, I assume they will be making it mandatory in the public sector. And then improving diversity in public appointments by setting ambitious targets and requiring progress reports to Parliament with explanations when targets are not met. So there's a whole slosh of extra requirements.
There's a whole load of costs for the taxpayer. Which won't actually change anything.
Sorry, then one more. Providing additional support and advice to employers on neurodiversity in the workplace, developing a cross-government strategy to tackle all that. So, you know, that sounds more of advice, and, you know, this is good practice, and this is the advice that we can give you, rather than any legal statutory requirement that those other things sound like they're going to be. And then the very last point on the Lib Dems, which you could say maybe not directly employment related, but I thought I'd just throw it in for the fun of our viewers. They want to reform gender recognition process to remove the requirement for medical reports. And they also want to recognise non-binary identities in law.
So basically what they're doing here is gender self-ID. Because if you
Exactly.
remove the medical requirement, then you're saying, well, who does decide that?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
who? Your vicar? The guy down the shop? Your landlord? The guy
Right.
who serves the beer at the pub? Who's going to make that money? Well, that's just gender self-ID. Can't get on board with that. That's crazy. And that would, as we're saying, Lib Dems, reality is they're not going to be in power. They might be part of a coalition. How much of this they'll be able to get through on a part of a coalition, I think, would be up for debate.
Right.
I do think that I'm surprised there's nothing about post office workers, given Ed Davies' experiences, in abusing post office workers. And on that matter, I can't help but think of the irony that here's a man who leads a party who oversaw the despicable treatment of post office franchise holders and sub postmasters when he was effectively the owner of the post office.
And then completely disappeared and went to ground as soon as this came to light, and didn't reappear for, I think it was a month.
Yeah, he's also the one politician who has, over the past few years, made a habit of leading parliamentary witch hunts against his opponents.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Has caused for many people's scalps.
Anyway, we're not here to talk about Ed Davies.
No, exactly.
Ed Davies' incompetence at running a public body.
Let's move on to the Conservative Party. So,
let's talk about the Tories.
Yeah, so as I said, they released, they had a conference at lunchtime. It's all now their manifesto published online. It's a multi-page document. I've obviously skimmed through it all and sort of delved into the sections that might be relevant to the place of work. And I've got about half a page of notes. There is really a shockingly little amount in there that has any direct bearing on employment and managing staff issues, which is surprising, but maybe it isn't. I mean, to me, it does give an impression of half-cocked. Are they really trying?
Yeah.
Half-hearted. That, have they given up in the writing of this manifesto?
Well, it does seem. I mean, I think first of all, from a starting point, I'm not a fan of governments doing things, particularly in areas like employment, unless they absolutely have to be done. And I think that on one hand, I welcome a government not looking to try and change the employment situation too much. However, there are elements in employment that we've talked about which do need addressed.
Absolutely.
So, for instance, the apprenticeship scheme, we know about that. And in fact, I'm surprised they haven't got anything in their manifesto about this, because I seem to remember a couple of months ago reading in the Telegraph that the government were looking at doing something about opening up the apprenticeship scheme. So why that's not in there, I don't understand. And I think also, there are other elements here around, things like IR35 that have been, the Tories have been fudging, which need to be looked at and need to be addressed. There's issues around how I think there's a big headache around how EDI has been impacted the workplace. And I know, Kemi Badenoch should be very vocal about this.
Yes.
It's created massive productivity issues. We know all this. It's cost people their jobs. So I'm surprised the Tories aren't doing something about that.
Yes.
If only best practice.
I'm just having a very quick search through their document on the subject of apprenticeships, just to double check that I haven't missed anything. And there are some references, but from what I can see, it's just reflecting on what they've done to date.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see any measures to change or as Labour and Lib Dems have done, for example, in terms of expanding usage of the levy. Can't see anything on that at all. So, yeah, that is surprising. So anyway, let's just talk through the points that I have pulled out. Now, I think, if anyone's seen the news since lunchtime, obviously one of the headlines is that they're reducing employee national insurance contributions by 2%. So that's another reduction. So they pointed out that they will have, their aim would be by 2027 to reduce employees' national insurance down to 6%. And it obviously started at 12%, so that would be halving it over that period of 3-4 years. And they have cited that their longer term intention, is to end national insurance. But there's no mention about employers' national insurance in this. They're concentrating solely on the employees' national insurance. So that's not going to be helping businesses. And I assume when they're talking about ending, their long-term goal of ending national insurance, one can only assume that, would that include employers' national insurance? I suppose you could possibly assume that. And so that's one of the sort of the headlines in the news about what the Conservatives have announced. And in terms of the self-employed, they are also going to be doing something to benefit them. So they are going to be ending the main rate of self-employed national insurance. Well, they say they would by the end of the Parliament. So that's by the end of the Parliament intention to remove the main rate national insurance from all self-employed, which is great for small businesses and self-employed people. And they said that will affect 4 million people. So, is there anything else? They talk about continuing with the implementation around minimum service level legislation around industrial action. They talk about maintaining the national living wage at their sort of target point, which is 2/3 of median earnings. So, it's currently at £11.44 an hour. And that's been quite a hike, which I know a lot of businesses have, particularly in the hospitality sector, for example, where, they have a lot of staff who are on that statutory minimum. And, the hikes that the Conservative government have implemented have been very difficult, and I'm sure haven't helped a lot of businesses, particularly around the pub industry, for example, going out of business because it's just yet another huge cost hike that they've not been able to maintain.
It's also been a problem in manufacturing over the last 10 years. I know of several manufacturing businesses who prided themselves on meeting the national living wage, but then when the Conservatives hiked them, it was under Theresa May where it was significantly hiked, they were unable to match that increase. And so they had to drop out of the national living wage, and it created some real problems. And they didn't, they tried every which way to try and maintain it. But, there's there's a lack of understanding, I think, around the on costs of employing somebody in a business. And this is not very well understood by the public. That when you are hiring somebody to work for you, you have got significant contributions to pay for the fact that you're hiring that person to work in your business. Especially around employers' national insurance, around pension contributions, and these all add up. In some businesses, we've added something like around about 25 to 30% on top of a salary as being an on cost for employing somebody. I would caution any small business, when you're hiring somebody, be very careful, because the salary you negotiate with them is not what they're going to cost you.
Most definitely.
And you'd be amazed at how many small businesses don't understand that.
Yeah. Or even managers or budget holders in a big business.
Absolutely. Yeah, they go a bit pale when you point out that their business plan has just been wrecked because they've missed out 20% of costs.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a few other points, and this isn't directly related to employing people, but they do give some examples of specific support that they would be implementing for SMEs. So these include reviewing the current sort of cliff edge for VAT of £90,000 to look at smoothing that. So obviously having a scale rather than just one side or the other of that £90,000 threshold. Continue to ease the burden of business rates for the high street by increasing rates on warehouses that supply online retailers. So currently it's just the retailer, but obviously now they're looking back in that supply chain and applying additional business rates to those businesses and then passing that benefit to the high street. And improving access to finance for SMEs, and they did go into some detail on that as well. So a few things that and they also were talking about digitization of procurement and payment routes, and doing things to ensure more prompt payments, which we know for SMEs.
This will be very welcome. This will be very welcome for SMEs. I mean, I remember about 15 years ago, there was a huge push on getting big organizations to pay small suppliers on time. And because at the time you were looking at most large organizations with 3 months. In fact, I know heads of procurement who would boast of the fact they'd got their payment terms out to 6 months. And congratulating themselves on how much money this was making their organization, whilst completely ignoring the devastation this caused their suppliers. I mean, you'd point out to them that actually this was just resulting in higher bills because those suppliers were being forced to factor invoices, and they were passing the cost of those invoices onto the end user.
Yeah.
But always tricky trying to get a procurement director to listen. They know everything about everything. But the other thing I would say is this is good news, because small businesses really struggle with cash flow, particularly at a time when the high street banks don't play ball. The business banks don't just offer clearing services these days. They're not really offering, any sort of, serious business banking for small to medium enterprises these days. Those days are long gone. If you want business finance, you go into commercial finance. So yeah, I welcome this. I think it's a good idea. It's just a shame that it looks unlikely they'll be able to actually implement it, which also begs the question as well, why didn't they do this 14 years ago?
Wow, right. And I suppose also, in terms of us saying, the Tory manifesto is very light when it comes to employment. Yes, it's good that they're not adding in extra burden or regulations or bureaucracy. However, we're still waiting for the potential benefits of Brexit. And one might have thought that this would have been their opportunity to have a more in-depth review of, what regulations have we got that emanated out of the EU that we can now, either ditch or amend or readjust. But they clearly, again, completely failed to take any of those potential benefits that Brexit availed to us as a nation, continue to ignore them and continue with the vast majority of all employment-related EU regulations still sitting there now as UK legislation.
It's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary, to have to fail to this respect, and I switch on the telly and I hear all these mainstream European parties bemoaning what's happened in the European elections this week, and without looking in a mirror and asking themselves why. Why has this happened? And a fundamental failure. And I really think that the political elites are across Europe are disappearing up their own bottoms, frankly, and because of their inability to actually deliver. I remember one of Trump's more interesting policies when he was president in his first term was that he would only bring in a piece of legislation if 2 pieces of the legislation were scrapped. And I think that was a really good policy. And I'd welcome that policy in terms of how employment works. There's a whole lot of things that can be streamlined. As a nation, our employment law manual is vast now. Something's wrong when you you go from a situation where you used to be able to cover all the employment law using a few folders on a bookshelf, and now you actually have to download a multi-hundred megabyte file, and if you printed it out, it would take up the whole bookshelf.
And that's just on employment law. Don't start on tax.
Don't start on tax. Yeah, how many pages are tax these days? It's about something like 80,000 pages or something.
It's a lot. It's
absurd. Okay, well that's great. I mean,
so that's the Lib Dems and Conservatives. So just Reform to go now.
I take it you don't want to do the Greens or anyone like that, do you?
I think we may pass on those and Plaid, the Welsh Party and the SNP. But no, let's cover Reform, who are very nearly second in the national polls. So it only feels right that we do cover them. And so the Reform manifesto is coming out later, or their contract, as they call it, is coming out later this week. So we will cover that. Now, again, as with the Lib Dems, yes, very unlikely to be in government, but sometimes those that are not in government can still be very influential to those that are.
Well, that'll be really interesting. Look forward to that. Hopefully we'll be able to do that before the end of the week.
Yeah.
In the meantime, when Labour do publish their manifesto, we will go through it and make any amendments to our original episode on this, which was published earlier today. You can find a link to that down below. In the meantime, have we got anything else to add at this stage on this subject?
No, nothing from me.
No. Okay, and it's nothing from me either. So I hope you enjoyed that, if you could call it enjoyment. And I hope it was of some value. So, as Steve says, we'll do our final episode on the UK election employment policies for each party by the end of the week. And if you have any questions, just add them below. If you want to follow us, please do so here or on Spotify or on Locals. We'll put links down below. And if you could also like and share this, would be extremely grateful. We are the only organization I've come across who are actually doing podcasts looking into how employment policies are from each party are going to potentially impact businesses post-election. So please share this. I'm sure people will find it interesting. Okay, so that's it for today, and it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Bye. There was a time, not so many years ago, when managing your business's HR was easy enough. Once a month, you'd pay your staff on time, you'd look after holidays, sick leave, pensions and other stuff. The only time the HR manuals were ever open was when you had to hire or fire someone. Life was straightforward and you could spend your time focusing on your business. But these days it seems like there's a never-ending cycle of HR crisis after HR crisis. From an increasing amount of red tape, to demands you comply with the latest social justice movement, to activist employees. How are you meant to manage all these competing demands that have nothing to do with a day job? It's hardly surprising that some days you might wonder why you got into business in the first place. There's an expectation that small businesses have the same legions of HR, lawyers and budgets for this sort of stuff that large employers have. There's also an expectation that you as a small business owner will understand the nuances and complexities of an increasingly complex employment law and Equality Act environment. This is incredibly unfair, time-consuming and costly. The problem is that if you get it wrong, and it's very easy to do this inadvertently, it might just end up costing you your entire business. That's why we set up Fair Job UK, the small business HR support service that allows you to get on with running your business. Join our increasing community of like-minded business owners and managers from all across the UK. It's considerably more affordable than you might think, and it may just be the best decision you made this year. Visit us at fairjob.co.uk or email contact@fairjob.co.uk.